Most people don't think small purchases are the problem. In fact, that's exactly why they're so powerful. Because when something feels small, it feels harmless. It doesn't trigger concern. It doesn't feel like something you need to track or question. It feels like something you can afford without thinking too much about it. And in 2026, that mindset is quietly becoming one of the biggest reasons people feel stuck with money. Because the issue isn't one big expense that's easy to identify, it's dozens of small ones that don't feel important in the moment. A coffee here, a quick delivery there, a subscription you forgot about, a few extra items added to a cart. None of these decisions feel like mistakes. Individually, they're small, manageable, easy to justify. But the problem isn't the size of the decision, it's the frequency. Because when small purchases happen often enough, they stop being small. They turn into a pattern, and that pattern starts shaping your financial reality. That's what makes this so difficult to notice. There's no single moment where you feel like you've gone too far. There's no obvious breaking point. There's no large transaction that makes you stop and rethink everything. Instead, it happens quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. That's why it's often called a money leak. Not because money disappears, but because it flows out in ways you don't fully pay attention to. And by the time you notice it, it's already had an impact. What's interesting is that many people today are actually trying to be more careful with money. They're thinking about saving. They're avoiding big, unnecessary purchases. They're trying to make smarter decisions overall. But even with that effort, progress still feels slow. And that's where the disconnect comes from. Because while people are focused on avoiding big mistakes, they're often overlooking the smaller ones that happen more frequently. It's like trying to fix a large problem while ignoring the smaller cracks that are slowly making it worse. Over time, those small cracks matter more than the big ones. Another reason this happens is because small purchases are emotionally easy. They don't require a big decision. They don't create stress. They don't feel like a commitment. In fact, they often feel like a reward, a break, a convenience, something that makes the day a little easier. And in a world where daily life already feels expensive and stressful, those small moments of comfort feel justified. That's why people don't question them. They feel earned. They feel reasonable. They feel like something you deserve. But when those moments happen repeatedly, they start to add up in ways that aren't immediately obvious. A few dollars here, a few dollars there. It doesn't feel like much until you zoom out. And when you zoom out, the picture looks very different. Because those small purchases don't just affect how much you spend, they affect what's left. And what's left is what determines your progress, your ability to save, your ability to invest, your ability to create financial stability. That's the part people don't always see in real time. They see the purchase, but they don't see the opportunity cost. They don't see what that money could have done if it stayed. And because that part is invisible, it's easy to ignore. There's also a structural reason why this problem is becoming more common in 2026. Spending today is designed to be fast and frictionless. You don't need to think ahead. You don't need to plan. You don't even need to pause. A few taps and the transaction is complete. That convenience makes spending feel effortless. And when something feels effortless, it becomes habitual. You don't question it. You don't analyze it. You just do it. That's how small purchases become automatic. And once something becomes automatic, it's much harder to control because you're not actively deciding anymore. You're just following a pattern. Another factor is that many of these small expenses don't feel like real spending. They're digital, they're quick, they're often hidden inside apps, subscriptions, or bundled purchases. You don't physically hand over money. You don't see it leaving in a tangible way. And because of that, the emotional impact of spending is reduced, which makes it easier to repeat over and over again. That's why more than half of people are now saying they want to cut back on these smaller purchases. Not because they suddenly became irresponsible, but because they're starting to notice the effect. They're starting to feel that something isn't adding up, that despite trying to be careful, money still feels tight. And often this is the missing piece, not a single big mistake, but a pattern of small ones that slowly, consistently pull money away from where it could have made a bigger difference. This doesn't mean small purchases are always bad. That's not the point. The problem isn't spending, it's unconscious spending. Spending without awareness, spending without intention, spending without realizing how often it's happening. Because once awareness increases, behavior usually changes. You start noticing patterns, you start questioning habits, you start making more deliberate choices. And those small changes can have a much bigger impact than people expect. Because just like small purchases can work against you, small improvements can work in your favor. That's the part that often gets overlooked. People focus on big financial moves, big savings goals, big income increases. But in many cases, the biggest shift comes from something much simpler: paying attention. Not to everything, but to the patterns that repeat. Because in the end, financial progress isn't always determined by the size of your decisions. Sometimes it's determined by how often you make them. And in 2026, the reality is this: small purchases aren't just small anymore. When they happen often enough, they quietly become one of the biggest forces shaping your financial life.